Hello and welcome again to another program of Searching for Answers, a program designed to help you, the viewer, to better understand the Bible. On my right is
Roy Branson from the School of Religion at Loma University.
Richard Rice, also from Loma University.
And John Jones, the School of Religion at La Sierra University.
John Brunt, the Azure Hills Church.
Ivan Blazen, Loma University.
Well, as you can see, we have some very expert gentlemen with us tonight. And if you think that you don't understand everything, let me know, and I'll tell them not to use big words, okay? My name is Carolyn Thompson, and if you want, get your Bibles out and turn to the book of John, one of the most favorite books of the Bible. John chapter 9, and I will ask my good friend, which one of you wants to start in?
Which one is your good friend?
Which one is your good friend?
Okay, Rick, I'll have you start in.
I was hoping.
Yeah, and
where
sort
are
of,
we here?
well, we got down to, I can't see because of the bright lights, but I think that's verse 30. So just kind of go back a little ways and kind of so that we don't get in the middle of the story.
Okay, well, just to recap, here is the man who was born blind and healed by Jesus, who's being interrogated by the religious leaders of the day. And they called the man who had been blind, I'll start in verse 24, and said to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man," that is the one who healed you, "is a sinner." And he, the man born blind, answered, "I do not know whether he is a sinner. One thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, "What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes?" He answered them, "I have told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciples?" Then they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but as for this man, we do not know where he comes from." The man answered, "Here's an astonishing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but he does listen to one who worships him and obeys his will. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a person born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." They answered him, "You were born entirely in sins, and are you trying to teach us?" And they drove him out.
Well, I would say that he had more insight than all the people who were trying to find out who healed his eyes and made him able to see. And
He also had a sense of humor, too, didn't he?
He did have a sense of humor. You know, I've told you already. Or do you want to be his disciples too? Or why do you keep asking
He's sort
me?
of an establishment critic.
That's right, he
Yes.
is, Ivan.
Yeah, had he been a student in one of our classes, he would have been a very difficult person to handle, I think.
We noticed you're identifying with the Pharisees.
Yes,
right off
that's
the bat.
true. Yes, I am, because
Well, this is sort of the fellowship of sinners here. We know that this man, Jesus, is a sinner, and you were born entirely in sins.
Yeah.
Here goes the downward trend of criticism. If you don't accept the word at first, it gets worse by the time you get
Yes,
down.
so it does.
That's right.
The fact of the matter is that everyone was puzzled by a case like this. How could it be if sin is if illness like blindness is a result of sin? How do you get born that way? And in the Talmud, the debates among the rabbis, we see that this was a particular question. People who were born with some physical deformity, how to understand? Was it because their parents sinned? Was it possible to sin in the womb? There are such proposals by some of the rabbis. So when they say, you were born completely in sin, that means from the square one, from the
That's
word
right.
go. They are pretty sure that something's really wrong here.
Well, you know, you're right, John, and I did not realize that they believed from the time of conception
Yeah.
that you could even sin in the womb. I'd
It
never
was
heard
cases.
that
It was
before.
cases like this that made
Yeah.
them think that.
Yeah, so we-
And of course, Jesus' own disciples want to have a kind of a theological discussion about
Yeah,
that.
they
don't
did.
They? Jesus.
They
Well,
sure
what I'm
did.
really interested in is where do we go from here,
Exactly.
rather than how we got here.
That's right. That's
But
right.
I think there's a natural tendency when we see suffering to try to make sense out of it.
Yeah.
And one of the more attractive answers, at least to people who aren't the ones suffering, is that it's deserved in some way or other, or at least there's a rational explanation as to why this is happening to that person and not happening to me. And
How did Jesus answer him?
well, Jesus said, let's not go there, basically. Let's
He
not
said
try to
it wasn't
figure
that
out.
the father and mother didn't
wasn't.
sin, or he didn't sin,
It's so that, well,
so that.
with the result
yes,
that.
yes, I'm gonna digging you a hole. Go right in.
I mean, I think all of us here have taught classes on suffering, and everybody here and everybody listening or watching has had this question come up.
Mm-hmm.
Why does suffering happen to certain people? Why is it so unevenly distributed? Jesus here has a perfect opportunity to answer that question, and he doesn't. He says, the question to ask is not, how did this come about, but what can we do now to respond to it? And I think that's the only way to respond resourcefully to suffering, and that is to say, what do we do now?
Exactly.
How can we open our lives so that God can perhaps work through this experience, or at least in spite of this experience, to move toward the fulfillment of his purposes?
There are all kinds of blindness, aren't there, here?
Yes.
The Pharisees don't know where Jesus came from. And they don't know, and he doesn't know why he is
Born blind.
sick. His parents don't know why he's sick. Other people don't know why he's sick. There's lots of things that people are blind about. And he's not averse to saying to his accusers, "You're blind too, not just me."
You have to give it to him. He's not going to take it. He says, "What's the matter with you? I've told you
Right.
already twice."
And on the other side, it's Jesus saying, "I am the light of the world." So there's all these kinds of things where there's a blindness and a darkness, and Jesus is the light. And the most important thing is to recognize that I am the light. To get through all those other lack of information, lack of knowledge, lack of conviction, you come
Right.
to me and I will cast light on all of those questions.
And it's interesting that the man is healed immediately from the physical blindness, but as we go through the chapter, his eyes really open slowly, in steps. First, he doesn't really know who Jesus is. He just knows that he healed him, and then he says, well, he's a prophet. And then he gets to the place where he says, well, he must be from God. And finally, he comes to the place where he says, I believe, and he worships.
Right.
And that's when his eyes are fully open.
Ivan.
Well, the last text of the chapter is interesting to
Okay,
me.
where's that now?
Just the very last verse.
Of chapter 9?
Verse
Yeah.
41.
41, verse 41. Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would not have sin. But now that you say, we see, your sin remains. Now this is an incredible indictment to anyone.
Who is he talking to here?
He's talking to these Jews who had raised
That's right.
questions about the
Okay.
blind man and his healing. But he says your sin, if you would admit that you were blind, you'd be okay. But by saying or intimating or feeling that you see, your sin remains. And so as I read this, I said, now what is their sin? What is the sin that remains? And I would imagine that in this chapter it is the sin of not recognizing Jesus and accepting him for what he truly is. It's an interesting contrast that the man born blind, he says, Lord, I believe, just up above, and he worshiped him, but the leaders are nowhere near that particular stance at all.
Don't you think that the writer of the gospel is recounting this incident to say to Jews who do not acknowledge Jesus at the time this gospel comes out, you're not seeing, and you are therefore sinners.
Yeah.
Yes, the contours of the debate carry forward into the first century of the early church. And indeed, this story appears even to be crafted in such a way as to lend ammunition to Christians so that they know how to reply to people who... Indeed, there's an interesting little wrinkle here. I think we may have mentioned it before. Up in verse 22, it says that the parents of the man were already intimidated. They were afraid of the Jewish authorities because the Jewish authorities had already decided that whoever confessed Jesus to be the Christ would be expelled from the synagogue. Well,
Excommunicated.
yes, the little word already gives it away there, doesn't it? Because this is exactly the situation we find when we read the epistles of Paul in the early church, that by that point, people who confess Jesus are indeed disallowed. They're expelled from the synagogue. So this already is kind of an anticipation of that. That tells us that the whole story is looking forward to what is going to happen in the time of its narration, that is to say, when it was written down.
Yes, yes.
Well, the worst people for the Jews of that time were not Gentiles, but Jewish Christians. And we're talking about now the time when this book is written. Jewish Christians were the biggest problem. They were thought to be the greatest heretics. I'm reading a book here, Why the Jews Rejected Jesus, and it's written by a Jew. And the man explains how these people, the so-called minim, were really despised. A Gentile's far better than a Jew who is turned to belief.
The worst enemy is a traitor, right?
Yeah. Well, that says it pretty well.
John, Brunt.
Well, a couple of interesting things here. There's an amazing amount of irony. We've already seen that in some of the blind man's statements. There's also an irony that goes through the whole chapter in terms of judgment, because in a sense, the Pharisees put the man on trial, but they really are trying to try Jesus. So it's a false trial. They're trying the man, but the real trial is to try Jesus. But then what they don't realize is that the real trial is to try them.
That's right.
And so there's a trial within a trial within a trial.
Yes.
A lot of irony that John has.
It's interesting they call Jesus a sinner in this trial. They make their judgment that Jesus is a sinner. Now, why is that? I guess because he healed on Sabbath.
Is this an environment where judgment is so important? I mean, who gets judged? Is this typical of religion, where people use religious ideas and standards to judge one another? Is that inevitable? Or is this something Christians should do today, or are we not supposed to engage in judgment?
Well, I think that the bottom line here is not that we judge, but that Jesus shines the light, and the light judges not in an arbitrary way, but people either open their eyes to the light or they close their eyes to the light.
Well, that's interesting, because light functions in a lot of different ways, and one would be just to shine a light on something is to expose it for what it truly is. And in a sense, it's not Christ who judges, so to speak, but it's Christ who shines the light then, and then the people the people who reject him are condemned by their own behavior and their own inconsistencies. Well, it's interesting that sight and blindness are so, light, darkness, sight, blindness are so important to this gospel, because the big question is, who is Jesus? And then it's, where do we see Jesus to recognize who he is? And in a sense, that's what the whole gospel is about, isn't it? So this is kind of a high point in that narrative.
And the ultimate end of knowing who Jesus is to have eternal life. I just thought of this verse that you know so well, John 5:24. Very truly, I say to you, everyone who hears my word and believes him who sent me has eternal life and does not come under judgment, a judgment of condemnation, but is passed from death to life. This man has received the light, and hence also the life, because light and life go together, as John 1 makes clear. The Pharisees somehow, they're not part of that thing. So, he is passed from death to life.
Well,
where are they?
The man starts out being the blind person, and the Pharisees, in the end, are the ones who are blind.
And his blindness is physical, and theirs is spiritual.
That's right.
So it's a far different
That's
blindness.
right. And they are responsible for their blindness, whereas he is not responsible for his blindness.
That's good contrast. Good. I want to preach that in a sermon.
Is that right?
Well, that's one
What's
of your
the handbill? Give me the...
He must have heard it and forgotten. I don't know.
Okay,
I probably told it to him before.
Here. It's a very easy question, sort of. But then when it says that, why was he born blind? Well, it's so that the glory of God can be shown. So what is your take on that, John Jones? Do you think that God arranged that so he could...
God didn't arrange that any more than his parents did. Jesus says clearly, it is not that his parents sinned with the purpose of causing their son to be born blind. No parent does that, and neither does our heavenly parent. It doesn't work that way.
So he didn't arrange that in the womb because he looked down and saw that it would make Jesus look very good that he healed him. Now,
we're going to face that again in chapter 11 with Lazarus, where Jesus says again, it is not that this illness of Lazarus is to wind up in death, but rather that we will have an opportunity here to show forth God's glory.
Right.
Indeed, not only in this, that's part of John's theology, but even when we go beyond John into Luke, chapter 13 starts out with the same problem. Jesus is asking people in chapter 13, opening verses, what about that tower of Siloam that fell and killed 12 people? Do you think that they deserved it any more than the rest of you? He says, I tell you no. But you should nonetheless remind yourselves from this that we all live day by day under the contingency of the human condition, and that life could be very short for any of us. Therefore, live uprightly. Jesus is simply interested in asking the question, where do we go from here? That's always his operating starting point.
It isn't I'm just repeating myself, but it isn't the blindness which has been inflicted on you. It's the blindness you choose that is the real evil.
okay. Can we go on from there? Has anybody got anything else to say?
Well, I just want to tie into this because there are people who read passages like this, who say, look, the Lord has the power to heal us. Why isn't there more healing? You know, why can't we simply ask to be healed and have him heal it? But I think what you've touched on is the fact that this particular miracle, shall we say, the rescue of this person from physical blindness, takes place within a setting where there's spiritual significance and religious significance, messianic significance. And that is, the physical blindness is secondary. It's the spiritual blindness that's primary. And I think if we read the Bible with the idea that now, if we have the right kind of faith, we can get divine power working for us and solve our problems here and now, we've missed the point.
Do you think that there should be more miracles of healing? Or why don't we have more of those in this day and age?
Boy, I've got a long answer to that question.
Well, make it short.
Okay. My sense is that these are exceptional events designed to direct attention to two things. One is the fact that God is working in Jesus' life in an unusual way, that he's giving a portrait here of what life will ultimately be like in the kingdom when it fully comes. And the other indication would be that God is at work in our lives in ways that we may not recognize. God is at work to accomplish his purposes in ways that are less dramatic. So,
well, do you think it's because we have, through the ages, since the time of John and the disciples and so forth, that we now have knowledge increased, so we can do a lot to help the sick and the blind and other diseases. And it's still a miracle, but God works. My husband said that when he was operating, he was be in a tight spot. Should I do this or should I do that? He would send a quick prayer up to Jesus, to God, to guide me as to which way I should go. And it would invariably, he would feel that he was being guided. So I'm saying that knowledge has been increased in our day and age, but people in areas where they don't have doctors or hospitals, have malaria, need help, I think that God is more open to heal those when a prayer has been asked.
Well, don't you think that healing goes or takes place because of God?
Of
sometimes
course.
slowly, sometimes fast.
And sometimes
And we
not at
call
all.
the fast healing miracles sometimes.
Yeah.
And the slow is the people who are working to get medical degrees and getting it through an internship and a residency. And,
Why
they
does
make a
he
little
heal some and not others?
Well, that's something that we have to ask God, but I'm just saying I think that we should attribute to God slow healing as well as fast healing.
We do,
Right.
absolutely.
And
We do.
Shouldn't we, you know, a number of us have had this course, God and Human Suffering, and also Medicine, Humanity, and God. And the important thing I've thought to tell the students is that they're working together with God, that God actually, can they conceive of this, that God actually works through them, through the physical means that are at hand, like the mud, let's say, that is here, to bring about healing, to give them that consciousness so that when they go out, they realize that they are in the employ of God. We even have this course, Medicine, Humanity, and God. Humanity is the middle term. Well, medicine's interested in humanity. God is interested in humanity. So that has to mean that medicine and God are allied in the function of healing. And that's what we hope we can get across to our students here in this
If
place.
there's any group that should believe that God works slowly in accomplishing his will, it's teachers. Because we're involved in miracles that take a bit of time,
A
right?
long time. And not always appreciated.
And as teachers, we want to say, don't we? What the first said, surely we are not blind, are we? Better not be. We're instructing these students, you know.
Yeah.
Oh my.
All right. Anybody have something else to say? Or shall we go on? Rick Rice, would you continue on, please?
Where are we? Are we going to
Well,
chapter
go-
10?
Chapter 10.
Did we
Yes,
finish
uh-huh.
reading the section on spiritual blindness? Okay. Yeah, I'll be happy to read. I read last time to start us
That's
off, so I
fine.
might as well go ahead. This is chapter 10 of the Gospel of John. Very truly I tell you, anyone who does not enter the sheepfold by the gate, but climbs in by another way, is a thief and a bandit. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. They will not follow a stranger, but they will run from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. Jesus used this figure of speech with them, but they did not understand what he was saying to them.
Okay, stop right there. I'll tell you something that happened to me up where we live in Redlands. It's sort of in a mountainous area, and I heard a little sheep crying, and he was running along the backyards, and I went up to try to catch him. He would not listen to me. He was terrified. He was going on, and I understood later that sheep that get separated from their group will run madly until they can die from being out of breath. And so here you see that the sheep, they don't follow anybody who's trying to help them. Only the shepherd. They recognize the shepherd's voice. And that is so sweet. As a lover of animals, I can understand how they do. And if you've ever gone up in the mountains when they're herding sheep, and they're out in the highway, and you have to go carefully through them, their master knows what to say and what to do. So, to me, this is a very tender part of verse 10.
We have an associate pastor at the Azure Hills Church who's been there for a third of a century almost, but who grew up in the Middle East,
Oh, yeah.
Pastor Elias. And he tells of seeing this very thing that is
Really?
behind here happen, where various shepherds will bring all of their sheep to a common pen at night. And then in the morning, the shepherd will come, and the shepherd has his own call, and he'll make that call, and in all those sheep, his sheep will all come. And
Beautiful.
the others don't
Isn't
come, but
that-
just his sheep, they know that particular call, they know his voice. Then another shepherd will come, and he'll do his call, and his sheep will follow him, and then in the end, they'll all take off with their own shepherd.
Everybody's sweetness and light here, so I'm going to bring in some darkness, I guess. But if we take seriously the audience for which this book was written, and I would take it, one of the main audiences were the Jews who were not accepting Jesus. Doesn't this a kind of metaphorical tour de force, this whole discussion? Because the question is who's in and who's out,
Yeah.
and who is legitimately deciding who's in and who's out. And one of the things that this Christian writer is saying is, you know, you Jews are deciding, you think you can decide who's in and who's out, but it's Jesus who decides. He's the gate, really, not you people over there in the synagogues.
Yeah, but those folk in the synagogue, they've got something to go by, which is mentioned in this chapter. So if you take a look at verse 28, then they reviled him, this man who was healed, and they said, you are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses.
28 of chapter 9.
Yeah, we know that
Yeah.
God has spoken to Moses. So it isn't as if these people are just mere rejectors. They have heard the voice of God, they believe, to Moses, and they studied Torah. This is the big thing for the Jew.
Well,
And
look,
some of the Jews did believe.
right,
some of
but,
them did.
But in here, it seems to me that they're picking up perhaps on some, this is just me speaking, picking up on some of the metaphors that probably the Jews of their day have used to describe the Christians. That is the wolves that have come over in a way that they shouldn't be, and they're stealing their sheep.
Well, that could well be. That could, I'm sure it was.
All right, we have a very short 30 seconds left. I'm going to ask John Brunt to wind it up for us.
Well, it's interesting. We've seen the story of a blind man who comes to see. And now we go to a different metaphor, and we'll continue on. And this metaphor will be used in several ways that we'll see next time as we continue on in chapter 10.
Very good, John. And we would ask our readers to follow along until next time. This is Carolyn Thompson for Searching for Answers.